We explained the triangle trade of slavery. By 1600, 100 years after Columbus first set foot in the Caribbean, most of the natives of that area, including the Carib, the Arawak, and the Taino, were dead. The Caribbean was also a war zone, as the French, the English, and the Dutch had moved into the area to secure their own cash crop-producing islands. Privateers and pirates roamed these areas, raiding Spanish treasure ships and settlements. It was the economic gold rush of the 1600s. The climate was ideal for growing the crops that had become very popular in Europe: tobacco for snuffing, and sugar for tea and coffee, and molasses and rum. The list would grow and eventually include cotton, fur, salt, fish, and timber. All of these led to large plantations and industries that would build wealthy ports in America and Europe. Merchants began to grow wealthy from the ownership of valuable natural resources, as did shipbuilders and investors. However, they lacked a labor force needed to gather those resources, at least a labor force that would accept little to no pay for the work so that the merchants could keep more and more profits. As we've seen, the Portuguese provided a model for their needs in the form of African race-based slavery. The Portuguese had been building forts and bargaining with coastal African rulers to capture inland Africans and then bring them to Portugal as servants, leading the elite of European society to increase their own demand of these servants. With the increase of Caribbean plantations and the lack of immunity that the natives had towards Eastern disease, Africans became increasingly captured, traded, and sent to work in the West into lifelong bondage. Not only themselves, but their children would also be traded and sold, creating centuries of hereditary slavery. This oppression of a race of human beings was also solely based on skin color. By 1800, 9 to 12 million African slaves lived in the Americas. The triangle trade of slavery became the chief economic engine of European power. Many African leaders spoke out, like Alfonso I. He was king of Congo who had lifelong ties to Europe, having been converted to Christianity and educated in European schools. He had been advised by Portugal on how to develop Congo into a better nation. Many Africans fought back, but resistance on any scale didn't stop the trafficking. The triangle trade was a profit center. Europeans would sail to Africa with finished goods like guns and cloth and rum. Once there, they would establish trading forts in West Africa, where they would exchange these goods with African leaders who went out and used slave hunters to capture rural Africans or members of stateless societies. The slaves were then branded and chained by the neck or the feet and loaded onto ships. Then they were sent across the Atlantic, or what was called the Middle Passage, the location of 15 to 25% of the death of slaves. Primary sources from slaves like Alawada Aquilano tell us about the deadly impact of the Middle Passage. They tell us about the beatings and the crowded, unsanitary conditions. They tell us about slaves jumping to their death in the sea. They tell us that 40 out of 100 slaves were dead before they made it to plantation. Then the slaves on the plantation would harvest the resources that were sent to Europe to make finished goods, which were then traded in Africa so the process could begin again.